So today we're going to be talking about nuclear waste. So I thought I would start with the nuclear fuel cycle because many of the problems related to the waste from nuclear weapons are similar to those for the nuclear fuel cycle, but there are also important differences. And so the work that I'm going to talk about today is really focused on the back end of the fuel cycle. So looking at reprocessing, vitrification and disposal of radioactive waste, and particularly the radioactive waste that was generated during the reprocessing of plutonium fuel to make weapons. So in terms of an agenda, I'm going to start with a two-part introduction. The first is mostly about techniques, which I'll breeze through because this audience is very well versed in synchrotron techniques. Maybe just a little bit more detail on X-ray magnetic circular dichroism, as that's a more sort of niche spectroscopy. Then I'll introduce the nuclear waste at the Hanford site and some of the features and complexities. Then I'll pause for any questions before moving into describing the current work that we're doing in iDream using spectroscopy to look at the complexities of the tank waste. And then moving along to looking at, once we've removed the waste from the tanks and we're processing it, then how it behaves in the waste forms that will be produced. And then finally, looking at once the waste is disposed, or if the waste is accidentally released into the environment, how we can use spectroscopy to look at long-term contaminant reactions, if I get through to that time point. Okay. So to start off with, I know this is not really necessary because everybody here knows what a synchrotron is, but there's a lot of postdocs and early career scientists who are starting their career and aren't able to go to the synchrotron. And I'm really hoping that we're moving towards the point where we can open up again and start traveling to do this kind of work, because it's just such a great experience to actually be there. And I just put this up because this was always my first impression of any synchrotron that you walk into. It's just like this mess of cables and vacuum lines and aluminium foil. So again, there are many people who have started their career and are working on spectroscopy, but haven't been able to access the beam lines. And so now we have the development of these laboratory-based X-ray absorption spectroscopy systems. Joe's influential in this, and now there's the company EXAFS that are producing these instruments. We're fortunate to have 3 at PNNL with different functions, and now there's a generation of synchrotron scientists who are learning to do the experiments on these kind of lab-based systems, and then we'll eventually get to go and deploy that at the synchrotron when we're able. So there's a vast array of synchrotron techniques. This is a very short list, not encompassing everything, but today I'm really going to focus on X-ray absorption spectroscopy and X-ray fluorescence mapping, and then X-ray magnetic circular dichroism. So I'm just briefly going to go through these techniques, focusing on recent advances. So for X-ray absorption spectroscopy, as we know, you measure absorption intensity as a function of X-ray energy, and you can do that either at the K-edge, where you're looking at really the behavior of the core electrons in the atom, and then the L-edge, which provides you more information on the 3D elements, and I'll talk a little electrons, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. They both tell you about oxidation state, but the K-edge gives you more information on local structure of the central atom, whereas the L-edge can tell you about magnetic properties and about those 3D electrons. So we're going to talk a lot about using XANES spectroscopy, which focuses on the pre-edge and near-edge region of the spectrum. Traditionally, we would measure a variety of different standards and with similar coordination environments, and then do a linear combination analysis to fit the data, as is shown in this example for technetium by Wayne Lukens. But now we're moving to using time-dependent density functional theory of subensembles, which are obtained from ab initio molecular dynamics, to actually generate the spectrum and compare with experiments. And I'll show a couple of examples of that. We'll also talk about EXAFS, where we're looking at the extended region. I won't go into it. This this group of people knows it very well, but we take the data and conduct a Fourier transform to get the radial distribution. And then we can do a shell-by-shell fitting to determine the type of atoms, their number and distances. But again, there are recent advantages in using AIMD simulations to directly predict the EXAFS and the radial distribution. And I'll show a couple of examples of that. So the final technique that I want to go through is X-ray magnetic circular dichroism, which takes advantage of synchrotrons being able to generate circularly polarized light, which is not something we can do currently in the lab. And so you can excite the 2p electrons either with right-hand or left-hand circular polarized light, and that will preferentially excite either the spin-up or the spin-down electrons. And then once they're excited, they then have to find a place to fall back into the 3D shell, and so it's very sensitive to the spin-up and spin-down constituents of that 3D shell. And the difference between these spectra, the left and right-hand circularly polarized X-ray absorption spectra give you the XMCD spectrum. So this is what it looks like for cobalt metal. You've got the right and left-hand circularly polarized spectra, and when you take the difference, you get this difference spectrum, which tells you about the occupation, the spin-up and spin-down occupation of the 3D electrons. You can also, if you're not able to change the circular polarization, you can also change the magnetization direction and get the different spectrum that way. So what do we do with XMCD? It is obviously element specific because it's an X-ray absorption technique, but it also tells you about the site occupancy, and that's particularly important when you're looking at magnetic oxides such as magnetite. And so each of the oxidation states of iron and magnetite and each of the crystallographic sites of iron and magnetite can be separated out using XMCD. And that is done traditionally using multiplet structures and calculations, which were pioneered by Gerrit van der Laan and others to generate these calculated spectra for the different sites. And then you use linear combination fitting to determine the quantity of those different sites within the magnetite structure. So you can tell what site is being replaced and what is the oxidation state of iron. Again, there's been more recent progression in terms of the understanding of the spectrum, and this is work led by Michel Sassy at PNNL, where he's gone beyond using the ligand field multiplet theory to calculate XMCD, and it's actually calculating the XAS from first principles using multi-reference configuration interaction calculations, and then generating the XMCD spectra. So it's an exciting development that's allowing us to understand more about the magnetic properties of these materials. Okay, so now for the second part of the introduction, those are the techniques that we're going to be using in our toolbox to study nuclear waste. I would emphasize that this talk, although its primary focus is synchrotron X-ray absorption techniques, basically all of the work that we do involves multimodal analysis, and so I will talk about some other techniques that we bring to bear alongside the synchrotron techniques to really understand the complete system. So we're going to talk today about the nuclear waste at Hanford, which is the Department of Energy's largest legacy nuclear site. It's the home of the world's first plutonium production reactor, and 67 metric tons of plutonium were produced for the US Department of Energy's weapons program here. That's resulted in a site that's a very large area that's contaminated, and it's the most contaminated nuclear site with the nation's largest environmental cleanup activity. And actually 60% of the US high-level reactive waste resides at Hanford. This waste is stored in 177 underground tanks, and this is a picture of the tanks under construction. These tanks contain 56 million gallons of radioactive hazardous chemical waste, and the makeup of those wastes involves 170 million Curies of radioactivity, 240,000 tons of complex chemicals, and we need to be able to remove the waste from the tanks as it's currently present in a liquid form, and then process that into a solid waste form that can be disposed of. And so the plan is to process that waste into a vitrified waste form. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, and then dispose of the waste in a safe manner. This whole process is expected to take about 50 years and cost about $300 billion US. So why is it so challenging? Why is it going to take so long and cost so much money? These wastes are highly alkaline, and they have very little water. There's insufficient water to solvate all the ions that are present in the waste. And that regime where you really have very concentrated electrolytes is still a challenge for both experimental and computational campaigns. And so we really need to we need large-scale activities like EFRCs to really push the understanding of these complex concentrated electrolytes forward. In addition to the concentrations, they've also been exposed to ionizing radiation for decades and are still radioactive. And so they're just complex multi-component mixtures that need to be processed. What are the chemistry of these complex wastes? Well, you can see here there's representatives from pretty much every element in the periodic table, but the wastes are dominated by sodium, nitrate, hydroxide, aluminium, and nitrite. And so although the wastes are radioactive and we spend a lot of time thinking about technetium and plutonium and uranium, it's actually these benign elements that cause the most problems in terms of waste processing because they're there in such high quantities. And one particularly problematic aspect of this is that aluminium, which is the dominant metal in the waste, is present in tetrahedral form in solution, and then as it's precipitated, it forms these octahedral solids, gibbsite and boehmite. And there is some limitations to this transformation mechanism that results in supersaturation of aluminium in the form of the aluminate anion in these highly concentrated sodium hydroxide solutions. So it makes it very difficult to predict the behavior because you don't know when it's going to start and precipitate from that supersaturated state, which is obviously has huge implications for trying to process those solutions and pump them through miles and miles of pipes to the vitrification plant if you don't know it's going to precipitate in those pipes and start clogging them. And so to be able to help mitigate some of that uncertainty, one way to do that is to characterize the chemistry of these wastes and really understand them in a predictive fashion. And that's what I'm going to spend the sort of meat of the talk talking with you about. So before I get into that, I'll just pause and see if there are any questions.
Yes, thank you very much. Do we have any questions? I don't see in the chat. Yeah, maybe I can ask one, but maybe you will talk about it later. So you mentioned that you generally thinking about technetium and plutonium. Any other elements which you think we have to really consider?
Well, for me, so I'll talk a little bit about iDream, but we're really focused on aluminium because that's what's causing most of the problems in terms of processing, and then the way that aluminium interacts with sodium, with nitrate, with nitrite, and with hydroxide. But then, as you mentioned, Christina, that there's technetium that's also an anion, a tetrahedral anion in solution, and then we have chromate, and so there are there's some examples of where you get the interactions between the aluminium phases and these other anions in solution, and they cause problems for processing as well. And so I'll give a little case study with chromium as an example for those sort of binary systems and how they and how we can understand them.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess maybe we can continue. I don't see any. Oh no, there is one question. Carolyn, do you want to read or do you want me to read it for you? Yang Ha is asking, I guess aluminium is sitting at a tricky energy, but it's hard to obtain nice XANES or XAFS. Any ways to resolve it?
Great question, great point. And you'll see that we've really struggled to get good EXAFS from aluminium. John Fulton has done a lot of work on that and collected a really nice data set. But we're anxiously waiting for the amber beamline at ALS to come online, because that is going to cover that perfect energy range for us and allow us to do solution chemistry. And so we're really excited to start accessing that. So that's going to solve all our problems.
Yeah, thank you. I don't see any other questions. Yeah, I guess we can continue. Yeah.
Thank you, Christina. So having set up the background for the waste and the chemical composition and some of the challenges associated with that, this was all covered in a basic research needs document for environmental management that was produced by Department of Energy. And there they describe the seemingly intractable technical challenges arising from limited knowledge of chemical and physical behavior in extreme environments. So these low water environments that have been exposed to radiation for decades. And so based on that, there was a call for EFRCs, and we submitted a proposal that's led by PNNL, but has many partner institutions: Oak Ridge, Argonne, Georgia Tech, Notre Dame, University of Washington, and Washington State. This was really focused around understanding that complex chemistry. So the EFRC is called Interfacial Dynamics in Radioactive Environment and Materials, or IDREAM. It's a bit of a mouthful. And it's divided into these 3 goals that we're trying to address, stepping through from understanding solution processes, and I'll spend a bit of time talking about that today. So how the solution structure is organized and how it changes in terms of dynamics and radiation-driven processes. And ultimately resulting in the nucleation and precipitation of those solid phases. All focused around that transition from the tetrahedral aluminate species to the octahedral solid gibbsite and boehmite. Once we have those precipitates, we move into goal 2, which is understanding the role of interfacial structure, because we know once we have precipitated those phases, then the precipitation is much more rapid, and those interfaces are really playing a role in templating the continued precipitation from solution. But they're also under the influence of radiation, and radiation at interfaces is not well understood. So that's a big overarching theme that we're going to go after. And then goal 3 is looking at that region between those particles. So when you have when you form the particles and you have these complex solutions, what's the interplay between the confined solutions between the particles and the particles themselves, and how does that affect the overall behavior of the system in terms of things like waste rheology? So I won't go into this slide in detail. I'll put the website up at the end. I would certainly encourage you to check that out if you want to find out more about our publications and our research. But we're divided into 3 science thrusts based on those goals that I just described. And then we have crosscuts that really allow us to accelerate discovery in the science thrusts, focusing on radiation and radiation dynamics, computational tools, and then a very well-defined toolbox of materials that are synthesized and characterized and used across the EFRC, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then we pass this information on to the relevant contractors, so that we have a flow of information to that applied scope that's really beyond the basic research that we do in iDream. This is a busy slide, but it's just trying to summarize all the different areas, and I'm going to talk about a few of them. And so this is the phase diagram for aluminium, water, and sodium, and the space that we're focused on, and all the different phases that can be generated. And the team has spent considerable amount of time being able to synthesize all of these materials with precision, and then use them to explore the transformations. And so those are the missing steps for us: how you go from these aluminate ions through this amorphous gel into gibbsite, and then higher temperatures, which happened in the tanks because several of the tanks, due to the levels of radiation, were self-boiling, and so the gibbsite converted to boehmite. They're both octahedrally coordinated. And then what are the dissolution pathways for those phases? And so we can use these well-established crystalline species from around this phase diagram to probe those transformations. Before we can get into that level of complexity, we first needed to develop the tools to be able to look at these really concentrated electrolytes, both experimentally and computationally. And a lot of that work was done by Showen and the team at Oak Ridge National Lab, who were able to develop special cells to be able to do X-ray and neutron pair distribution function measurements. And then Aurora Clark and David and the team at Washington State University, who really pushed the limit in terms of molecular dynamics simulations to understand the system. And we started with the most simple system we could, which is concentrated sodium hydroxide, and really started to get an insight for the challenges associated with the complexities, because David's work really showed that there were many different configurations for sodium and hydroxide within this concentrated network. And he was able to reveal distinct signatures, which are very sensitive to the conditions. And once we were able to establish those clusters, then we can look at how they would interact when we add in things like aluminium and nitrate and nitrite. So that was the next step. That was using X-ray and neutron spectroscopy, but now once we add in aluminium, we can use aluminium K-edge XANES spectroscopy, which is in that awkward tender region, but we can certainly get good near-edge data and good enough quality that we were able to see these very subtle effects of increasing the sodium concentration. And through the time-dependent density functional theory calculations of Andrew Wildman and MD by Ernesto, we were able to resolve specific ion effects in solution that were responsible for these very subtle shifts in the aluminium K-edge. Aluminium K-edge is not just useful for looking at ion pairing and specific ion effects. You can also use it to track that transformation from tetrahedral through pentahedral to octahedral coordination. These are calculations again done by Andrew Wildman. And we've really been trying to capture those intermediary states, but haven't been able to with the time resolution that we have access to in the lab. Even with all our control of the phase diagram, to be able to poise it at conditions where we know the solution will be stable for a number of hours or days. So this was actually a neutron PDF experiment where we started with a clear solution and then precipitated gibbsite. But even doing that in the beam, we weren't able to catch any of these intermediary steps. And so we were lucky enough, as iDREAM was renewed last year, to welcome a new partner, Linda Young from Argonne National Lab, who is an expert in ultrafast spectroscopy. And we have been working on developing a campaign proposal for LCLS to be able to use radiation as a trigger to set off that transformation, and then be able to measure it at the timescales required to capture these intermediary phases using these calculated aluminium K-edge XANES spectra. So this is very much future work, and we're very excited to move into this space. And Emily Nienhaus, who's a postdoc here at PNNL, is working with Linda to ramp up and get ready for our first experiments at LCLS. So that was all sort of solution chemistry and pre-nucleation species, and now we move into the solid phase. And one of the real strengths of iDREAM is the materials that we work with, and Xin Zhang at PNNL leads that materials crosscut, and is just really an expert in generating nanoscale precision materials, either gibbsite or boehmite and other phases, to allow us to study their behavior. And we were able to collect some XAFs, so we were very pleased with that, some good quality aluminium K-edge XAFs, which we were then able to explore using the AIMD approach, which provides a less ambiguous basis for data interpretation than the traditional shell-by-shell fitting. And so we could take the structures of gibbsite and boehmite and really understand the possibility for any defects that might be present in the structure and characterize the structure at an atomic level. Okay, so building up in complexity, we've gone through solutions and solids, and now we're going to add in another element, chromium, which is present in the tanks through these various processes, and does have implications for the behavior of gibbsite and boehmite that aren't really well understood. And so a team of researchers at P&L, led by Xin and Kevin, have been looking at adsorption mechanisms for chromium on boehmite in these highly alkaline conditions. And this is one of those multimodal studies, and so I'll step through several techniques before we actually get to the X-ray absorption and what that tells us. And so I'll just move forward. So to begin with, we wanted to understand the effects of metal coatings on boehmite, and we're using chromium as the case study. And so the starting point is these very well characterized boehmite materials that are nanoscale. We know that the surface area and the size distribution and the crystal structure of these materials very well. Xin and the team then, with Wen, who is the PhD student working with Xin, went to look at uptake of chromium under these highly alkaline conditions, and you can see that it drops off with sodium hydroxide concentration, and so they started looking at a sodium hydroxide concentration of 0.1 molar. Oh, 0.1 molar, sorry. They wanted to look at the absorption behavior, and were able to fit it with a Langmuir isotherm. So that tells us that the chromium is bound directly to the surface of the boehmite in a monolayer form. Looking at the kinetics, that gave us some information on the adsorption process, and confirmed that it was a chemisorption process. And we could confirm that by doing the diffraction of the boehmite after reaction with the chromium, and there was really no change. So what's the mechanism for the chromium association with the boehmite particles? The first hint that we had for the mechanism of interaction was using high resolution atomic force microscopy, and carried out by Xin, where he was really able to see at an atomic level these clusters of chromium sitting on the boehmite nanocrystals. So we took those samples to the advanced photon source and did chromium K-edge EXAFS, and we were able to compare the Fourier transform with previous work by Charlet and Manceau for chromium sorbed onto goethite, and really be able to propose the structure of these clusters and how they're interacting with the aluminium in terms of corner sharing versus edge sharing interactions based on the bond lengths. Using that information, Micah Prang was able to develop a model of the cluster on the boehmite surface, and then verify that matched with the EXAFS. And so we have a very good understanding of how the chromium is interacting with the boehmite. What implications does that have for boehmite dissolution? Well, interestingly, it shows that the chromium clusters on the aluminium actually reduce the kinetics of dissolution of the boehmite, so they increase the dissolution recalcitrance of the boehmite, and there is some evidence of that happening in the tanks, and so we're working to understand what the chromium to aluminium relationship is in the tanks through this fundamental understanding of chromium sorption and precipitation on boehmite surfaces. Okay, so that was a brief tour of some of the ongoing work in iDREAM. Now I want to switch focus from understanding the chemistry of the tank in the wastes to how it's processed into a waste form, and how we can use spectroscopy to develop a predictive understanding of contaminant behavior within those waste forms, again working towards mitigating risk and uncertainty. So as I mentioned previously, it's proposed that radioactive waste will be immobilized in glass. So the supernatant from the tank waste is mixed with glass forming chemicals, and then vitrified at 1150 degrees C, and poured into these cylinders ready for disposal. And glass is really a suitable matrix for this, because it allows for substitution of the radioactive ions within the amorphous structure and results in a very a chemically durable product. And we need that durability because the goal is to produce waste forms that are stable for millennia. And so this is some work that was actually done by Viviana at PNNL, and Sarah did the X-ray absorption spectroscopy to look at the behavior of specific elements within the waste. And the initial work was done at the APS, but after we weren't able to access APS, we were able to switch to our easy EXAFS system and continue the analysis to elucidate how the vitrification temperature and time actually impacts on the redox behavior of the glass waste forms by tracking the oxidation state of chromium. In addition to vitreous waste forms, we're also looking at cementitious waste forms, and this is work again by Sarah Saslow, doing lab-based studies of cementitious waste and trying to understand how we can learn from concrete that's still present, that was produced in Roman times, to improve the performance of this cementitious waste form and close the gap on the durability of glass versus cementitious waste forms. And so Sarah conducted a detailed study looking at technetium incorporation into mineral phases that are present in cementitious waste forms like ettringite, to be able to understand mechanistically how the technetium is immobilized in these mineral phases, and to inform future strategies to enhance that incorporation. And so she produced these cementitious waste forms, sectioned them, and then took them to the APS and was able to show the different behavior of technetium within the waste form, from the reducing interior, where the near edge technetium data showed that there was a significant contribution of reduced technetium sulfides, whereas at the oxidizing exterior, most of the technetium was present as pertechnetate with some magnetite. And so just understanding how the technetium is behaving as a function of distance from this waste form will enable better predictions of performance and also improvements in formulations to improve that immobilization. Okay, so a brief trip through waste forms, and now I'm going to shift to the environment. But before I do that, I'll pause to see if there are any questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Caroline. We have several questions. First is maybe the comment from Matthew Marcos that aluminium can be measured at beamline 1102.2 and cosmic at ILS. And EXAFS was also done there. In fact, when you showed the aluminium data, was it collected at ILS? Or? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it was collected on beamline 631.
631. Okay. Then there is another question from Sang Su. Caroline, could you explain some more details about the defect chemistry in aluminum oxyhydroxide phases, such as gibbsite and boehmite? Are you interested in the atomic level structural defects, something like oxygen vacancies, elemental defects, or mesoscale defects, such as grain boundaries?
All of the above things.
Yeah, exactly. I assume as well.
So I didn't talk about it today, but there's a really nice study by Sebastian Mergelsberg that's just been published in Nanoscale, where he's really looking at those defects. Specifically in gibbsite, which is synthesized at low pH. And then we want to do these experiments where we expose it to these high pH solutions. We were noticing some differences in the spectroscopy, and it turns out that there is a defect that actually gets incorporated into the gibbsite layers as it builds under those acidic conditions. And we're actually excited about that because we're hoping it's going to tell us something about the mechanism of formation of the gibbsite, and Xinzhang has been working on this for several years, and is really making some huge steps in understanding as you under acidic conditions, as you form those initial clusters, and then what pathways those clusters take in terms of the phases that are formed, and what the rate limiting steps are. I didn't have time to talk about it here, but I'm sure that you'll see presentations from Xin and Sebastian coming up where they really go into detail on those defects within gibbsite and boehmite and how it links back to their formation mechanisms. Xin also has a whole industry of doping in different metal ions into the gibbsite and boehmite structures and understanding, you know, to what extent you get sorption versus incorporation. And so again, you'll see hopefully many papers coming out from Xin and his team on that. But then, yeah, once you build up to particles, so in ST3, there's a lot of understanding of how the particles actually aggregate and potentially aggregate to larger crystals, and then again looking at grain boundaries and some of the techniques they're using are really sort of cutting edge in terms of the types of atomic force microscopy that they're doing, where they really need like perfect surfaces, and in pursuit of that, they're learning a lot about the defects and the grain boundaries. And that's Ben Legg and Elias Nikuzian team.
Yeah, so next question is Mrs. Smith. Does part of the waste processing include neutralizing the alkaline environment?
Well, yes and no. So the waste is actually moved in concentrated sodium hydroxide, but there's a desire to there's a need to control the sodium concentration, and so these wastes are often diluted with or proposed to be diluted with raw river water to reduce those concentrations, and that's part of the reason why we need to understand this system better, because as you dilute them to dilute the sodium concentration, you're obviously also diluting the hydroxide, and that might result in precipitation of the gibbsite. So it's just a very fine tuning between getting the right concentrations that are required for vitrification and maintaining everything in solution.
Yeah, another question is, did you measure solution samples for aluminium K-edge spectra? Yes.
So the data in Andrew's paper was from solutions, and as I mentioned, John Fulton has some really nice data on illuminate solutions over a wide concentration range, trying to get at those potential oligomers that start to form prior to nucleation. But what we saw was that really the XAFS is insensitive to that oligomerization, and we need to use other spectroscopies like Raman, where you can certainly isolate the dimer motif using Raman spectroscopy, and then as the dimer starts to oligomerize, we need to find other spectroscopic signatures to really track that process. So I've sort of gone off track, but yes, we have measured aluminium in solution at the ALS.
Yeah, another question, are there aluminum or chromium analogs of ferrihydrite?
Ferrihydrite. Yeah. There's certainly similarities between the iron and aluminium systems, and there's a lot of ongoing work between PNNL and Aurora Clark's group at Washington State University. Dan Pope and Will Smith are the PhD students who are working on that to understand how magnetism in the iron system changes the behavior with respect to the aluminium system. For ferrihydrite, you know, we're certainly seeing these amorphous aluminium oxide that are key intermediary components between the solution phase aluminium and then the gibbsite and the boehmite precipitating, and we're actually trying to get more information of that using NMR, which is much easier to use for aluminium than it is for iron. And so again, yeah, lots more to come in that area. But great question, thank you.
Yeah, one more question from Kate Morris. I guess we all, in fact, we all also asking ourselves. So I found it a great question indeed. So Kate is asking, thank you for the great talk, Carolyn. Is it possible to access real samples from the tanks for analysis to bridge between iDream and the tanks, or is it just too difficult?
It is possible to access some samples from the tanks, and that's one of the beauties of doing this work at PNNL and our other institutes, where we're working very closely alongside the more applied aspects where they are actually looking at the tank waste. And there's some really nice work by Edgar Buck looking at the nanoparticles of gibbsite and boehmite that are separated actually from the tank waste, and just showing us the how they're really influencing the behavior of the waste. There's been a huge campaign over many years led by Kurt Cantrell and others here, characterizing waste chemistry and looking at how things like technetium and uranium interact with aluminium and iron phases that are present in the tank sludge. And that was really to support the retrieval of waste from C farm, which has now ended, and waste retrieval is moving to ANAX farm. So we're hoping that that kind of sampling regime will take place again. We'll have access to information on the tank samples so that we can link across to what we're doing in iDream. And the chromium is a good example of that, where we worked with Reed Peterson, who'd identified these unusual behaviors of chromium and aluminium in the waste, and then we're trying to piece it together with what we're doing at a fundamental scale in iDream.
How active they are, in fact, from the real samples?
Sorry?
How active are, I mean, if it's possible to take the real material from the tank, what is the activity levels? Do you know? I mean,
they vary substantially from tank to tank, but the tank waste is processed in our radiological processing laboratory here, which is able to handle a significant level of radioactivity. And there are glove boxes where the waste can be taken and then sort of portioned out into sizes that can then be moved on to the high precision equipment that's also in the building. So we have a grand arm TEM, we have AFM capabilities and FIB TEM, SEM. And so RPL is really set up to take that waste, process it into a form that can then be moved to analysis, and then ultimately to the point where you have a small enough sample that you can actually take it out of RPL and look at it in some of our other facilities. So it's really designed to do that full process from highly radioactive material in quantities that couldn't be handled in a normal facility, and then process it down to samples that can be analyzed by different techniques.
Yeah, we have several more questions, but I guess maybe can we keep them for the next break? For the end of the talk. Yeah, I guess maybe, yeah, let's continue, and then I will continue reading them, yeah, in the end. Yeah, so Jerry supports me. Excellent. Thank you, Carolyn. Yeah.
Thanks, Christina. So we're into the last part of the talk, which is really we've progressed from understanding the signatures of the tank waste and then how it might be processed into a waste form, but we still have to address the tank waste that is leaked into the Vado zone here at Hanford, and also understand the long-term behavior of contaminants as waste forms degrade over time, and so we can understand the interaction of radionuclides with the components of the subsurface, and be able to predict the movement of those species through the subsurface and potentially into groundwater. So I'll quickly try and run through a couple of examples. The first part of the talk is going to be focused on technetium, which is a thermal fission product of uranium and plutonium. It's a contaminant of concern because it's highly soluble, so it has environmental mobility, and it has a very long half-life, so it's going to be present in the environment for a long time. And it's a major environmental problem, particularly here at Hanford, where 700 Curies of technetium were released into the subsurface. It has interesting biogeochemistry. In the saturated zone here at Hanford, it has the potential to be reduced from technetium-7 in the precipitate form, which is a tetravalent anion, to technetium-4, which is a precipitate, and there are a variety of different technetium-4 bearing phases, such as technetium oxide, magnetite, and then aluminium and iron, other aluminium and iron oxides. And there's also technetium sulfide phases. In the unsaturated zone, where the conditions are more oxidizing, there are still mechanisms by which technetium can be entrained through precipitation of phases that occurs when you have a change in in pH in the system, and so you're getting dissolution and reprecipitation of things like aluminum silicates and phosphates, and so they can physically trap the pectinitate within the structure. And so really understanding the environmental stability depends on the nature of the immobilized phase and any potential for reoxidation. What we hope to demonstrate is that there are mechanisms in the subsurface by which technetium can become immobilized so that it's no longer a future flux to groundwater, but to be able to rely on that and as a long-term remediation strategy and to potentially enhance conditions for immobilization, we need to understand more about the mechanisms. And so to do that, we started by really looking at the sediments at the Hanford site, and these were collected by Don Baer and his team several years ago, and fractionated to look at the magnetic mineral fraction, which was predominantly composed of magnetite. And so we were interested in how that phase that's redox active interacts with pectinitate. Additional characterization of those phases was conducted at the advanced photon source, and through that analysis we were able to show that it was actually in a solid substitution series between magnetite and ulvospinel, so it contained a significant amount of titanium. We demonstrated through that work that the dominant composition was X equals 0.15, so that we were able to synthesize micron-sized particles and then nano-sized particles in the lab that were representative of those natural materials present in the subsurface, with the nanoparticles having high surface area so that we could look at reaction kinetics on a laboratory scale. Magnetite has an interesting structure. Titanium magnetite, apologies, has an interesting structure because once you dope in titanium 4+, you need to reduce some of the iron for charge balance. So the doping of the titanium really allows you to control the solid state iron 2-3 ratio, which should in principle control the thermodynamic reduction potential of the mineral. So we synthesized these materials and took them to the advanced light source, where we were able to look at the iron L edges at beamline 402. XMCD is conducted, the signal is monitored in total electron yield, which means it's very surface sensitive with a probing depth of about 5 nanometers, but that probing depth is very much surface sensitive and decreases with depth as you move into the particle. And this is through collaboration with Elke Arenhoutz, Alvar Ndai, and Patrick Schaefer, who are the beamline scientists. So Elke's now moved to Oak Ridge National Lab. This is what the data look like for this series. So we didn't want to just make 0.15. We wanted to really understand how the titanium could be used to control that solid state iron 2-3 ratio. And so we did X-ray absorption, and then the XMCD was a really powerful tool because it showed that as we get to these higher substitution levels and we're increasing the amount of iron 2 present, we're actually not doping that into the structure. So we're seeing in the XAS a lot of the iron 2 signal increasing, but in the XMCD, it stops increasing at about an X of 0.35. That suggests, because we're not getting that magnetic response, we're not actually doping the iron 2 into the structure anymore, and it's actually a separate iron 2 rich phase that's not part of the titanium magnetite. So once we characterized the system, we were able to do some reactivity to understand the behavior of the system dynamically when you expose it to solution chemistry, and solution chemistry containing our contaminant of interest, pectinitate. This is work done by Jenny Liu at Peking University, who showed that you could really correlate the reduction potential for pectinitate with the iron 2-3 solid state ratio as doped in by that titanium substitution. And again, we went back to the APS with Steve Heald and Marlene Dale to look at how the pectinitate was interacting with the iron surface. So it doesn't just precipitate a TCO2-like phase, it's actually, there's evidence in the EXAFS for coordination with the iron 3 at the surface of the nanoparticles. And using a combination of micro-XRD and XMCD, we could show that the mineral phase itself wasn't changing, but we saw a decrease in the cell parameter, which suggests oxidation of structural iron 2. And then the XMCD told us that we were actually getting localization of that iron 2 at the surface of the particle. So it's moving from the bulk nanoparticle to the surface and then reacting with the pectinitate in solution. Once we'd demonstrated it with our nanomaterials at shorter timescales, we could go ahead and just make sure that we were getting some reactivity with the natural material that we isolated from the site, and we were actually able to measure technetium reduction and correlate that with oxidation of iron 2 in the structure. What's the overall relevance to the tank waste in Hanford's Vado zone? Well, once you've been able to quantify that that extent of technetium reduction by the mineral phases, you can then multiply that up by the amount of reactive phases in the subsurface and propose a sort of a maximum natural attenuation that might occur if the technetium interacts with that mineral component in the subsurface. And that all contributes to performance assessments for the site and understanding and predicting radionuclide mobility. Okay, last example, if I can, really quickly. I'll try and get through this because it's some work that we did quite a few years ago, but I think it has some cool elements to it, so I'll try and whiz through it. Again, this is work that was done at APS. So it's all very well understanding the pristine mineral phases, but when they're in the subsurface, the arrangement in terms of the pore-scale geometry really affects the interaction with the contaminants and the flow of the contaminants. So if you have a very small particle size, you get diffusion dominated transport, which is much slower than when you have advection dominated transport, when you have these larger gaps between grains. So we wanted to understand how that's going to affect the interaction of radionuclides, and this study was done with uranium and materials in the subsurface, specifically minerals and microbes. And so we wanted to look at how pore-scale processes affect uranium behavior in the presence of metal-reducing bacteria. This is Geobacter sulforeducens. This work was done by Mike Wilkins when he was at PNNL. He's now at Colorado State University. And we wanted to put those organisms in a pore-scale environment that we could control. And these microfluidics devices that allowed us to do that were the brainchild of Changyong Zhang, who's now at ExxonMobil, who made these microfluidics with a defined pore structure that allowed us to look at the influence of that structure on the processes. This is what the setup looks like. So you have many pumps that pump the solutions through the micromodels. These are the micromodels themselves. This is what they look like in terms of the size and shape. And they have these input and output ports and this controlled pore network dimension that we could image and really look at how that affected precipitation of different mineral phases in uranium. So this is a green fluorescent protein labeled Geobacter sulforeducens that let us look at the growth using fluorescent microscopy. And you can see that they're growing at sort of the downflow side of these in the pore space where the flow is reduced. And you can see that they grow in this region over time. Then, having established our microbial community, we also wanted to look at the effect of minerals, and so we precipitated an iron oxide phase within the micromodel, and then we added in the bacteria to grow on that iron phase. And this is what it looks like. This is the precipitated iron phase in the center of the micromodel just by flowing an iron 2-bearing anaerobic solution and then an oxidative solution. And then we grew the geobacter, and where you see these bright spots are that's the fluorescence response to show you where the communities are growing within the micromodel on this iron oxide substrate. We took them to the APS after introducing uranium as uranium nitrate into those micromodels so that we could map the uranium and see how it was interacting with the pore spaces, the microbes, and the iron minerals. And these were the results. So you can see these are the pore spaces within the micromodel. This is the geobacter growing in those pore spaces, and this is the uranium associated with the metal-reducing bacteria. And we could determine that we were getting reduction of the uranium, and it was actually present as uranium-4. For the iron-bearing phases, we were able to show that if you have a redox shuttle, the Geobacter sulforeducens was able to reduce a small quantity of the iron, but not to any specific mineral phase. It was just iron 2 adsorbed to the ferrihydride that was precipitated. And there we saw a mixture of redox. So the uranium was interacting with the iron and the Geobacter and getting retained even in the +6 oxidation state, as well as being reduced. So these results, these collective results have implications and tell us about how uranium will behave in these pore spaces and where you might see accumulation as a function of the local mineralogy and microbiology. So my main takeaway message is that X-ray absorption spectroscopy is essential in all of these studies to really understand the complexities of the tank waste, and then the stability of the waste forms and the interactions with the environment. And I'd just like to acknowledge the support for the EFRC, iDREAM, and various other Department of Energy sponsors who've contributed to this work, as well as the many people at the Beamlines that we really partner with and are a huge part of this research, and the researchers that have made it possible. And thank you to you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Excellent talk. Great overview and a lot of impact results on different sides. In fact, we have a lot of questions, so I don't know, Jerry, do we have limit on the time? Or
we can go for a little while. Well, certainly at least 5 minutes, maybe a bit longer, no problem.
Excellent. So maybe then I will continue reading the questions. So the next one was about how it's again about the interaction chromium and aluminum using the EXAFS. How did you find chromium oxygen aluminum bond, and is it different between chromium oxygen chromium by EXAFS?
It is. There are different bond lengths, and we were really able to do that work because of that influential work by Charlet and Manceau on the interaction of chromium and goethite. And so we know the bond length and the bond angles for if the chromium oxygen chromium interactions, and we were able to show that there are differences, and that the aluminium phase, the boehmite, was actually templating those clusters, and we were seeing evidence for differences in the bond length and edge sharing versus corner sharing interactions than you'd see if you just had Cr2O3, for example.
Mm. So one comment from Kevin Rosso about the ferrihydride. The aluminum analog of ferrihydride is called agdalite, and there is no known chromium analog that I know of.
Thank you.
Yeah. So another question, could you please explain the origin of all the aluminum in the waste? What is the role in the fuel cycle?
So the main role is for fuel cladding. So it's aluminium fuel cladding that's then removed and dissolved during processing. It's also added as aluminium nitrate as a salting agent in the tanks. But the main source is really the fuel cladding. That's where it comes from.
One comment from Tim Hyde, aluminum NMR is a key technique to understand the quantifying 4-5-6 coordination of aluminum. NMR.
It sure is, and I could have given a whole talk on. I would. Trent Graham, who's our NMR expert, he could have given a whole talk on how we use NMR in iDREAM, and certainly would be happy to do that, but perhaps not in this format.
Yeah, and last question, what I could see in the chat from Peter Botts: how resistant to reoxidation are the magnetite reduced technetium phases from, for example, oxygen ingress into the environment, tanks, and so on?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. We'd love to have done more work on sort of reoxidation kinetics, but there are other groups that have really studied that and shown that, or work here by John Zacher and others have shown that if you have TCO2, that's pretty susceptible to reoxidation, especially if it's in nanophase form. But once the technetium is associated with the iron oxide phase, there's some recalcitrance to oxidation, and then obviously the ideal way to do it is to form the sulfide, because then you have another intermediary step. So you oxidize the technetium sulfide to the oxide, and then it's oxidized back to pertechnetate. So it's very much dependent on the chain length, the lengths of those technetium chains that I showed that were associated with the iron mineral, and then also the nature of the precipitated technetium phase.
Yes, I don't see any more questions in the chat. Also, nobody is would like to ask question. I guess that was it. Maybe may I ask the one question, because you generally talk about the technetium as a 4 and a 7. Do you expect that we might have some kind of oxidation states in between, like 5, 6, and so on? Do you
Yes,
believe it's possible?
it would be really, you know, there has to, again, it's that, you know, the electron flow that results in the reduction, right? There has to be some kind of intermediary steps. And so I think understanding that would be, and being able to isolate those intermediary technetium phases is really important. And there's lots of great work that's done in several groups, one of which Tatiana Levitskaya here at PNNL has looked at using EPR and NMR to get at all of the oxidation states of technetium and poising the electrochemistry to look at those intermediate phases. And then her group has also identified some low technetium oxidation states that might be stabilized in these extreme environments in the tanks. So yeah, lots of rich technetium chemistry.
Yeah, thank you very much. So then I guess we can thank you, Carolyn, for the great talk.